These and that. Okay. Let's start with the attendance. Okay, everyone's good with the attendance? How many of you are still working on it? Good? Okay. So, before I start the lecture, any questions, comments? Okay. I'm going to come back to the attendance. And you know, last week, I tried to schedule as many office hours that I can. And now this week, I'm going to have like more office hours for my one-on-one class because they're struggling. So email me if you want to meet with me, and I schedule like tutoring sessions with you, okay? And I try to also post some sessions based on the attendance last week, so I still can have like, you know, tutoring. And you have your tutoring with Sean today at 4. So I'm going to give him some material to solve for you and also for extra credit. So I advise you to go. I'm done. So don't worry about that. So I just included these 2 slides from last session, just kind of reviewing that when we had like, can anyone tell me when we had 2 or more benzene rings that they are fused together, what type of compound do we call them? Yes, naphthalene, but naphthalene was apparent, you know, as an example, I included these, right? And also if you have like more than 1 benzene ring, you have similar types of reactions, but depending on where we attach that substituent, we can have different types of isomers, right? So just kind of like review of what we talked about these types of compounds. Any questions? Good. And compound of a group of compounds, right? So we call them fused polycyclic hydrocarbons, or in general, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So we call them aromatic because they have a benzene ring, and polycyclic, poly means, you know, more than 1, right? 2 or more. And as I said, you know, I'm not going to ask you the name of these compounds, but that's why I didn't even include them, the names here. But you should be able to identify what they are, what is the parent compound, which is naphthalene, and similar things, okay? And also the reactions, a reminder, I wrote your quiz 4 and homework 12, and it's based on the materials that we learned until last Friday. So you can just take it at any time if you are comfortable with the previous materials, okay? So originally I wanted to cover as much as materials that I can, and then I realized, you know, what if you want to take it sooner? So it's fair that I don't include the materials that I'm teaching today and Wednesday. Any questions? Okay. So we started chapter 7, and I told you that I skipped chapters 5 and 6. And when I get the chance, I'm going to, as well as all other things that I'm going to do, adding your extra credits or your tutoring grades that you came to my office, or like class participation. I still have lots of things to do. But I scheduled lots of tutoring for my other class and this class last week, and also writing makeups. So it was taking lots of my time. But I'm going to also update the course schedule and syllabus so it reflects what I'm actually doing in the class. Because if you look at the course schedule is just really off. So as we know. So I skipped chapters 5 and 6, and now we're going to talk about alcohols, phenols, and thiols. And the reason that I did that is that, as I said, for chapter 5, we talked about the stereoisomers. In chapter 2, a little, so you have an idea, and also some types of reactions, when we have halogens in our hydrocarbon. You also have some ideas of those, but I want you to know as much as organic compounds as possible. So now I went to chapter 7. So, nomenclature of alcohols. Can anyone remember, based on what we talked about briefly last session, how do we name these compounds? So we have two ways to name alcohols in general. Anyone remember? So probably you know of methanol, ethanol, right? Based on previous knowledge. So what is specific about their naming? Methanol, what?
OL.
Exactly, they have OL at the end, okay? So you see, this is one way to name alcohols. When you add OL at the end, when I say ethanol, you know there's an alcohol, it has an OH group, and this is what is specific about alcohols. They have OH attached to the rest of the molecule, okay? So what is the other way to name them? Can anyone tell me based on what I wrote here? The other way is to just explicitly we say alcohol in the name. So one way to name this compound, for instance, is to call it methanol. The other one is calling it methyl alcohol. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to kind of make this smaller. So what is the name of this compound? Exactly, CH4 is methane. One thing is that it doesn't have any double or triple bond. It doesn't have any multiple bonds. So we know we have an alkane, right? And we have only one carbon, so we know that we have like methane, right? If you had two carbons with ethane, propane, butane, and so on, okay? So if I eliminate one of these hydrogens and then add OH instead, okay? So what we do is that we add, so we get rid of, this A and E, and then we add OL, methanol. So this is how, so instead of saying methane, we call that methanol. I wrote that really ugly. So this is how, so because we have one carbon, and then we add OL, and this is the only way to say it, methanol. So why didn't I wrote, and it was something that I emphasized in last class, is that previously when we had like double bond and substituents, or like triple bond and substituents, we said that we focus more on multiple bonds in naming. So we name the compound where we see the double bond first, remember? And based on that, for instance, if I had something like this, right, and then I had like a methyl group, and then we would say, should I go left to right or right to left to name this compound? Right to left, right? Because I encountered the double bond here at carbon number 1, 2, 3, 4. But if I go the other way, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And I don't want that. I want the numbers to be lowest as possible. But in this case, we care more about OH group, even if you have like multiple bonds. We name it somehow that we encountered this OH group sooner. But here, why didn't I say 1 methanol?
So it could go in either position.
Exactly. So so there is only one possibility. We have only one carbon. Even if I put the OH like here, right? And then here would be hydrogen. If I just like rotate the molecule, I have the same structure. So anytime that you have only one possibility, you don't want to write it's not necessary. So that was one possibility, one way to name this compound. So the other way is that, what do we call this part of the molecule? CH3. What? Methyl, right? So we have methyl, and we know that we have an alcohol. So we call this compound as a whole methyl alcohol. So this is like two ways to name alcohols. One way is to just add OL at the end. The other is to write, the other part of molecule excluding the OH and add alcohol to it. So by that rationale, so if I have this compound, what should I name it? So we count that we have 2 carbons here, right? So what would be the base name of it? Ethyl, right? So it has like here. And then we add OH at the end, or ol rather, we call it ethanol, or we call that ethyl alcohol. And again, you don't have to put any number, because there is only one possibility, and I encourage you to draw the structure like what I do, right? So even if you put the OH anywhere else, even if you attach it to the other carbon, for instance, right? So are these 2 structures different? No, right? It's kind of like just if you just, rotate your paper, or like, I, rotate my iPad here, I get exactly the same structure. So that's why we don't have to put any number. Okay, but here, for instance, so here, when you have like more carbons, I have CH3, CH2, CH2, OH. So here I should number the carbons, and I say this is 1 propanol, because if I attach OH here, that would be a different structure. These are not exactly the same. Does that make sense? And then here we call that, normal N propyl alcohol, and then here we had like isopropyl. So remember those, like for instance for butyl we had like tert, sec, iso, butyl, like different structures. So this comes from that naming system that previously we had with naming alkyls. But regardless, you should know that it's kind of alkyl propyl alcohol. So here also we call this isopropyl alcohol. Does that make sense? Questions? Yes.
So will alcohols mainly happen in like alkanes because there aren't any double bonds, or would you see an alcohol with a double bond?
We see that one with double bonds.
Okay.
Great question. And I have like one example in the next slide.
Okay.
But when we want to name them, we use the naming systems nomenclature that we learned previously, but here we name somehow the carbons in main chain that we encounter OH soonest.
Yeah.
Great question. Any other questions? Okay. And here I have like more examples, as you see, I put lots of effort in this slide again. So you have like your examples from the book that I also included here. So make sure that you go through all the examples and cover the name, try to name it yourself, and also have the name and draw the structure, because basically, most of the questions that I give you, I just look at your book and then say, what is the structure of this compound? So as long as you know the examples from your book, you can answer most of the questions in the exam. And if you learn this, probably if I give you something else, you can also answer that specific question. Okay, so here is the example, one example that your friend asked. And you are welcome always to have like the structure, the expanded version. So I always myself rather to have like the expanded structural formula to see what's happening, what is the longest chain and all that. So CH2 is double bond C, and then C, and then here we have like only 1 hydrogen, and then here we have H2, and then OH here, right? So this is CH2, right? And this is double bond, this is CH, and then CH2OH. Okay, so when we want to name this compound, first of all, you should find the main chain, and then you should have your main chain somehow that it has the double bond, and it also, you see the substituents, right? So should I go right to left or left to right?
Right to left.
Right to left, right? Because as we said, we care more about this OH. So we say 1, 2, 3. Okay, and if we consider this, do I have, except of my OH, do I have any other substituent? Right? So we never consider hydrogens substituents per se. So what is the base name of this compound? Yes, so we have like 3, so it's like prop in a sense. And then we have like a double bond, so we call that propene. So if I only had like this, right? So how would you name this compound? Hopefully I put everything correctly. Okay, so what is the name of this compound?
Propene.
Propene. Okay, so here I have the carbon number 1 that is attached to an OH, so that's why I call this, and this is kind of like the thing that I was saying, is a little weird naming these types of compounds, because it doesn't seem that much appealing to write, but this is like the IUPAC naming system, so this is what we follow. So that takes care of the OH, or like alcohol part of the molecule. So carbon number 1 is attached to an OH. And here we have, so what is the number of carbon that double bond is attached to? 2, right? So we call that 2 propane 1 ol. Okay? And I also search for the name of this compound, and sometimes in some versions we can also put the E here, so write it 2 propane 1 ol, but this is like the more conventional one. But I'm not going, if someone writes this, I'm not going to deduct points from them. As long as you know, we write the OH ol at the end, right? And then the carbon number that OH is attached to, and then here the carbon number that double bond is attached to, and then the name of the compound. Does that make sense? Questions? The other way to name this compound is to say, this is allyl alcohol, and this is like what we name this part of the compound, except the OH group. But I'm not going to ask this one in your exam, at least before I cover like in more detail about like different substituents and different types of compounds. I'm not going to ask that. But for the alkyls, or like methyl, ethyl, propyl, those ones you should know. Okay? Any questions? Good? So what about this one? This is structure here. So if I have just this, what do we call this compound? Exactly, cyclohexane. And now what we did, we added an OH here, and your book just wants to emphasize that the valence of carbon is 4, so we have a hydrogen here as well. But even if I have this, you know that your carbon here is also attached to 1 more hydrogen. So these are like the same. So what you do, you just add ol at the end of this cyclohexanol instead of cyclohexane. Okay? And if you just want to name, it the other system, you call that cyclohexyl alcohol. And if you write the carbon and hydrogens, it would be obvious that this is an alkyl, the other part of this part. Okay? So what about this structure? Let's kind of look at this in more detail. And sometimes when you're writing these structures, when you see a, benzene ring or like, benzyl substituents or phenyl substituent, it can get confusing. What I always advise for you to do is to just substitute that substituent with something simpler like chlorine or like bromine, something simple, and then name it, and then substitute that part with the substituent. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Okay. So, and as we mentioned during 2 sessions ago during our class, we said that when you want to name these compounds, and it was the case for these guys too, and especially when we have like the benzene ring, there's 2 ways to look at this structure. One way is to say that I have a benzene ring and it has a substituent. Or you say that I have my main compound being CH2OH that is attached to a substituent, right? Depending on how you look at it, you can have 2 different names. So let's look at the first one. So let me do this. So if I have CH2OH and so what is the name of this compound? Methanol, exactly. So this is methanol. And what we did, we got rid of this hydrogen here and we added this. So can anyone remember what was this? Phenyl, right? Exactly. So that's why we call that phenyl methanol. And again, we don't use any numbers because even if you put this phenyl here or here, it would be basically the same. Okay. So now the other way to look at this structure, what did we call this that I highlighted and also covered the structure? Can anyone tell me what is this? Exactly. So we call this benzyl. And that is bonding to something else. So this is benzyl, and when I add an OH, what would that be? Exactly, benzyl alcohol. Is that clear how we do that? Questions? Good. Okay. Okay, here rather, right? That we have like 2 propene, 1 O, right? So we should also have the name of the compound here, for instance, propene, right? So go to the next slide. So are we good with the naming? Good. Okay. So I mentioned this really briefly during our last lecture that when we want to classify different alcohols, it's kind of our carbocations. Can anyone tell me how would I name or classify different types of carbocations? I had like tertiary, secondary, primary, right, or unique. How did I name that? So how would I say I have a secondary carbocation?
It was a carbon that had an extra substituent that wasn't a hydrogen.
Yes, yeah. So when we had, for instance, tertiary, I had this carbon that has positive charge. That's why we didn't have 4 bonds because we lost, electrons, right? So basically, we have C+. That's why it's carbocation, right? It has positive charge. And it's bonded to 3 other, substituents rather than hydrogen. So that's why we call that tertiary. Or we had like this, C+ that is attached to 2 different substituents, and it bonds one bond with hydrogen, right? Because we should have 3 bonds because we have a carbocation. But here, since we have 2 substituents, we call that secondary. Does it seem familiar? So we call them secondary, tertiary, primary based on the number of substituents that are attached to this carbon. So it's really similar naming system for alcohols. So if you have your alcohol, so how would I know that I have an alcohol? Exactly, when I see OH here, I know that I'm dealing with alcohols, right? So if to my carbon, if I have like only one substituent attached, so when we're talking about these, we're thinking about like carbons or things that are not hydrogen. Does that make sense? So if you have like one R group attached to this carbon, we call that primary. If it's like 2, we call that secondary. If it's 3, we call that tertiary. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So now we want to talk about phenols. Can anyone remember? And I told you, for your homeworks, when I ask questions about like different types of benzyl or different types of aromatic compounds, that basically compounds that they have a benzene ring, I didn't give you the table because I assume you have your book and everything, or like the PowerPoint lectures. But in your exam, as I told you, I'm going to give you that structures, that picture that had like phenol, what is cumin, what is toluene and all that. I'm going to give you that, okay? But when we do more practice, you kind of like remember what was what. So can anyone tell me what was phenol? Yes, we had an OH attached to our, benzene ring. Okay. So if you know that this is phenol, how would you name this compound? Exactly. Do you remember that we had like different, based on where atoms are located compared to our substituent, we call them, for instance, what about this structure? What is the name of this one? That is orthochlorophenol. Exactly. Or what if it was here? Meta, right? Chlorophenol. So what if I want to name, and I hope it's not confusing, so the first name that I wrote correspond to this, right? And this one correspond to the blue one. So it has like this one and that one, okay? So what if I had more? So what if, and here I put like this circle so I don't have to write the double bonds, right? So these are like the same. So what about, for instance, this structure? How would I name this one?
3,5-chloro.
Dichloro, right?
Dichloro, yeah.
Exactly. So we said when we have more than 2 substituents, we cannot use meta-ortho-para because it doesn't make much sense. Because here, when we have only one substituent, we see that, okay, this location compared to this OH is meta. But when we have like more, we just use the numbering system. And when you want to call this compound phenol, what you do, you start naming from here, from OH. So that's why you write that 3 and 5 dichlorophenol. Okay. But what if I have let me write this structure as well. So I have OH here, I have Cl here, Cl here. So how would you name this one?
3,4 dichloro.
Exactly. So we start naming from the other direction, because if I go here, what we 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I want to have like lowest numbers, right? So it would be 3 and 4 dichlorophenol. But what if I tell you in exam, and you have like similar question in your homework too, I ask you what is the other name of this compound? And what I mean is that you name it somehow that it has benzene in it. How would you do that? And while you think, I have the structure. I don't know why I cannot do it better than this. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and I have this, and I have OH. I have Cl here, Cl here. So what would be the name of this compound if it has benzene in it? Does that make sense? What I'm asking you is that what is the other name of 3 and 4 dichlorophenol? And what I mean is that writing the name somehow that it has benzene in its name instead of phenol, right? Because phenol is benzene that has OH attached to it, right? So how would we name this one? Anyone?
Would it be 3,4 dichloro 1 OL benzene?
So tell me the name so I write it.
So 3,4 dichloro.
Okay.
And then dash 1
Uh-huh.
dash OL benzene.
Like this?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we had so that's interesting. Okay, so what I had in my mind was that we should start from where we had like more substituents, but as I said before, as your friend mentioned, we should also care about naming OH first. So let's see, if I name here 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4 dichloro 1 OL. So I think, yeah, that is correct. Does that make sense to everyone? But the point here is that now we don't have any benzene. Does that make sense? So we want to show that if we have a benzene ring. So this structure, so we should also have benzene in the structure, because if I don't have benzene, it means that the structure, so this is in the sense of finding the substituents and the OH group is right, but it doesn't tell me what I have. I can have benzene, I can have propene, I can have, butane. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So we should have the name of the compound as well. Yes?
Can you just add benzene to the end and have that be an accurate representation?
You go dichlorobenzene without the E one.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
It's kind of like the example that we go here. We call that 3 and 4 dichlorobenzene 1 O. Does that make sense? Questions? Okay. So let me go back to the.
Thank you.
So here, but it's just yes.
Does the alcohol always come first, though? Never circumstance or other?
Yes. Yeah. Great question. So here, but these compounds, we usually name them based on phenol. So but you should be able to, identify them if we want to write it as benzene as well. So let me go through one more example, and I put and then here we have like some examples, but I didn't talk about aldehydes, benzoic acid, So as I said, anything that I didn't specifically talk about in the class, I'm not going to ask you. But things that we learned, I expect you to know. Does that make sense? Okay, and hopefully I talk about aldehydes, benzoic acids, and also different types of functional groups, so you have the knowledge of that too. But let me just go through one more example. So here we have again, we have OH attached to our carbon here. We start naming that from 1, right? Because OH, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if we have 3 bromine attached to our phenol, right? And we call that 2, 4, 6 tribromophenol. Does that make sense? Kind of this is similar to what we were doing before in the previous classes. Okay, so this is that. Any questions here? Are we good naming phenols? Good. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is hydrogen bonding. And in chapter 2, we talked about hydrogen bonding. And again, I included your book, basically. So I make sure that you study this. And also, I wanted to just kind of copy paste this part, and explain. So I figured I just have the whole thing. So it would be easier for you to read. And also easier for me to copy paste, I guess. So, can anyone tell me what was hydrogen bonding? Anyone remember?
It's the strongest form of bonds.
Exactly, it was the strongest form of bond. But was it between 2 molecules or within a molecule? For instance, if I have H2O, right? So H2O. So is it like this bond here, right? Or is it between hydrogen and oxygen in each molecule? So the black one or the red one, which one is hydrogen bonding that we talked about in the class? Black one, right? Remember, it's like intermolecular forces. Hydrogen bonding, or those types of bonds that we talked about, right? Can anyone tell me what type of bonds we had? Exactly, van der Waals, dipole, and hydrogen bonding. And we said hydrogen bonding was type of dipole, and it was the strongest intermolecular force. But what did we call these bonds here, the red ones? Or let me have these back to black. So this one, what do we call this bond? Covalent bond, remember? Covalent bond. And covalent bond is stronger than hydrogen bonding, right? Because the interaction between the atoms in a molecule is much more stronger, right? Compared to interactions between different molecules. To give you an example, if I have water here and I want to have hydrogen and oxygen out of it, I should do work, right? I should give them energy to do, hydrolysis, to have oxygen and hydrogen in them separated. But in order to have just hydrogen molecules to break the bonds, I can just heat them easily, and then evaporate them. So kind of those bonds, kind of separate the molecules from each other. So this bond is always stronger than this. And between what atoms I could have had hydrogen bonding? Is it just anything that has hydrogen? Can you remember what was it? Exactly. So these 3 elements that are really electronegative and hydrogen. So how we had that was that, for instance, NH3, right? So if I had NH3, between nitrogen of NH3 and, for instance, oxygen from H2O, I could have had hydrogen bonding. So it would be hydrogen from one molecule, nitrogen, fluorine, oxygen from other molecule. Does that seem familiar? Good. Any questions? Okay. So if you accept that from me, what type of bond do you think exists in alcohols? So alcohols, we said they have OH, right? So this oxygen, from like this molecule, so what do we call this one, first of all? CH3CH2OH. Ethanol, right? So we have, OH, so basically this oxygen from this molecule with hydrogen from the other molecule, they can form hydrogen bonding. Does that make sense? So here, alcohols form hydrogen bonds, and your book is talking about comparing, the boiling point of, and then this is, I didn't talk about in the class yet, but when you have like oxygen, this functional group, oxygen by itself that is attached to two different atoms here, we call that ethers, okay? But as I said, this is not the focus of our chapter now. I talk about like alcohols, okay? But I'm going to cover ethers later, so I ask you questions about that. But right now we focus on OH. So as you see, the boiling point of ethanol compared to alkane, so what do we call this one? CH3, CH2, CH3. What is this one? Propane, right? And you can also write the formula here, C3H8, and then you say, okay, this is CN, H2N plus 2. So boiling point is considerably higher, and that is because ethanol can have hydrogen bonding. And remember, if the number of carbons, we remember that when the number of carbons in a chain would increase, the boiling point would increase too, right? Because the mass of the molecule is increasing. So when we are comparing the molecules, so now if the focus is on hydrogen bonding, we should have like similar number of carbons. Otherwise, if I have a carbon, a compound here, for instance, C10H22, and then if I want to compare boiling point of this with that, I should give you more information because it's just not straightforward how to compare them, okay? So that's why in your chapter 2, I was, if I was asking you questions, I would consider one of them. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Are you following me? Okay. And here is kind of like the demonstration of hydrogen bonds, similar to what I wrote previously here, right? That you have like oxygen, of one of your molecules with the hydrogen of the other one. And both of them, should have hydrogen in their structure as well. Does that make sense? It's hydrogen bonding. But for instance, if I have bromine from one molecule, so if I have like HBr, for instance, and ethanol, so between these two molecules, I cannot have hydrogen bonding, although this oxygen here can form bond with this hydrogen that is not attached to oxygen, fluorine, or nitrogen. Does that make sense? So these are kind of just review of what we learned, but now using our knowledge to distinguish these things in alcohols. Any questions? Good. Okay. So this is also like, kind of like explanation of what I just told you, but I have like the part of your textbook to make sure that you read those. Okay, and here we also have like boiling point and water solubility. So how do you think the alcohol would dissolve in water? Would they dissolve or not? What type of bond hydrogen has as intermolecular force? H2O. What type of intermolecular force exists in H2O? Hydrogen bonding, right? And then, what type of bond methanol and ethanol have? Hydrogen bonding, right? So, for instance, methanol, ethanol, propanol. So they are completely miscible in water. It means that they dissolve really well. But when the number of carbons increase, the solubility decreases. What do you think is that? So when we have only, CH3OH, for instance. So this molecule, it has a strong hydrogen bonding, right, between itself. So for instance, methanol, if you have like methanol, the interaction between methanol molecules, that force is hydrogen bonding, right? So if I increase the number of carbons, the molecule becomes less and less polar, right? Because now, if I have like these long chain, I have carbons, and then I attach OH here, so most part of the molecule is non-polar, and just only this part is polar. Does that make sense? So in general, so there is a limit, right? If the number of carbons is much more than the part of the molecule that is non-polar is like much larger than the part that is polar, this molecule as a whole would be considered non-polar, or like is a slightly polar. Does that make sense? So that's why when the number of carbons increase, the solubility in water decreases. Does that make sense? So what about boiling point? So you see that boiling point here to here. So boiling point is increasing throughout. Why is that? Exactly, because your mass is also increasing. And when we're talking about boiling point, not only we talk about hydrogen bonding and intermolecular force, we also talk about the weight of the molecule, right? Any questions about this? And again, I expect you to read the book, which is basically, you have the book here in the slides as well. And then ask me any questions that you have, because you're going to see these things in your homework exam and all that. So I just start, acidity and basicity. So based on your previous chemistry class, can anyone tell me what was acid, what was the base? And in my 101 class, I just give really simple definition, which is like a straightforward, I hope, for students to recognize. So if I give you something like HNO3, is this an acid? Why?
Because it starts with a hydrogen.
Exactly. So this is what I was telling in my 101 class, that if we have H, we have an acid. If we have OH, we have a base. Okay. But that is kind of really basic definition, and we have several acids and bases that they don't have H or OH explicitly in their structure, but they are still acids and bases. And this is what we're going to talk about in our class next session. So I just end the lecture here, so we don't have to worry about me going overtime. And I go back to the attendance slide.